Welcome back to Viewpoint. I'm Mai Berry. Yesterday, the Arab League confirmed its suspension of Syria and gave the Syrian government 3 days to halt violence or face economic sanctions. Joining me now is Murhaf Jouejati, a Syrian-born specialist on Middle East affairs and Syrian politics. He is professor of Middle East Studies at the National Defense University, a lecturer in political science and international affairs at George Washington University, and an adjunct scholar at the Middle East Institute. Murhaf, thanks so much for joining us
Thank
tonight.
you for having me.
I want to start by asking you actually about the Arab League decision, which is extraordinary to give in context for a variety of reasons. One is it's frankly not a body that acts frequently in this way, and more importantly, because of the position of Syria traditionally in the Arab world. So share with me a bit of your perspective on that.
Extraordinary, the word you used is absolutely right. It was a momentous decision for the Arab League. The Arab League, as we have known it until recently, has been truly a dysfunctional organization. And here it is taking initiatives and acting on them. On important countries. Syria is an important and founding member of the Arab League. Syria has always claimed and will always claim to be the defender of Arab rights and the champion of Arab rights. But it so happens that the regime that is dominating Syria today is killing its own people. It's using lethal force against an essentially unarmed civilian population that demands freedom. And so that the Arab League finally stepped in, made a plan which the Assad regime duly violated, did not abide by, and now the Arab League is going to make the Assad regime pay for the consequences of not abiding by these norms.
There was a time in the beginning of this where there was a sense that if some reforms were taken, things could potentially be sort of mainstreamed and we could move on. Because there really was a genuine sense that this couldn't happen in Syria. The level to which the government had operated, there really wasn't a perception that this could go down the way that it has. Since March, we've had 3,500 people killed. And there is pretty much no one left that is advocating that Assad remain in power. What do you see our next steps given where we are today?
Well, Assad now really has no choice but to step down. You're absolutely right. The entire affair was totally mismanaged. And in the beginning, the people wanted to give Bashar al-Assad a chance to reform. And in fact, in the very beginning of this uprising in Syria, the popular demands were for reforms. But reforms did not come. And instead what the Syrians heard from Bashar al-Assad in a speech before Parliament on March 30th, was that all this was a foreign conspiracy, and that he was simply going to do nothing. Of course, the violence increased, and so the popular demand were for him to leave. And now the slogans in the streets are for the execution of Bashar al-Assad. This tells you how mismanaged the whole thing was and how angry the Syrian body politic has become. It is too late now. It is past midnight now for the Assad regime. He, of course, in the eyes of his people is illegitimate. And now, regionally, increasingly, he is seen as having to step down. And also, for the most part, internationally, this is the same case, except for a few very lonely friends that he has out there.
We do, as you know, a lot of polling in the region, and a recent poll that we did looking at support for either the regime or the people, it was profound. I mean, we had figures you don't get when you do polling, 99%, in Jordan 100%. There really is a sense that this cannot continue. Having said that, the resilience of the regime seems to be striking here, both the fact that you have the opposition movement that's frankly lasted longer than others had thought. The response has been fairly brutal, and people didn't expect that it would continue the long. So if you had an opposition that seems to be fairly resilient and continuing, you have a regime that doesn't seem to kind of get the message, whether it's allies like Turkey, whether it's people in the Arab world who traditionally held Syria to a very important role, are no longer saying this is the way it should be. Where does the give here?
Look, the Assad regime, for all practical purposes, is in the stage of collapsing. it cannot last much longer. The economy is imploding. It is at a standstill. There are sanctions right and left onto Syria. There are now significant defections from the army. And so the regime cannot last. And yes, the opposition is determined to institute change. After all, this is nearly half a century that Syria lives under an authoritarian regime. This man in particular, Bashar al-Assad, seems to think that Syria is his family farm and that his people are the cattle. Well, that is not the case, and they want to get rid of him. Now, my fear, of course, is that in the determination of the Assad regime to hang on to his seat and to power, and in the determination of the protesters to kick him out, that increasingly this is becoming militarized as a result of the brutality of the Assad regime, and that this militarization is no good for anybody. And so really here, it really is, for the most part, up to the international community to intervene in some fashion so that to catch this before it catches on fire, not only in Syria, but regionally as well.
Well, let's talk a bit about that, the idea that we now have defectors from the army who are engaging in military operations against army installations. It's a little hard not to see this in the category of a full-out civil war in a matter of days. Given that, what do you think is the proper international response to prevent further bloodshed?
Well, we're not in a civil war yet, and the hope is this would not go there. What has happened in terms of military operations before yesterday against an Air Force intelligence building outside of Damascus, this was an initiative taken by the Free Syria Army. Now, this was one of the very few and one of the very first initiatives. The hope is that the Free Syria Army would lend protection to civilian protesters, but not more, not to engage or initiate operations, because this is precisely what the Assad regime wants. The Assad regime wants to come out down hard and justify to the world this coming down hard on the Free Syria Army and others. So this would be, I think, falling in the trap of the Assad regime. What is at stake here really is the unity of Syria, that it does not enter into civil war, and it is again incumbent upon the international community, the Security Council, to step in, to not only condemn the Assad regime and refer this to the International Criminal Court, but also to send monitors, civilian monitors, to Syria in order, again, to deter the Syrian army from doing the things that it is doing, the bestiality against these civilians. It is really a political solution that is necessary here, not a military one.
Let's take a caller from Virginia. Good evening, caller.
Yeah, hello. I have a question about the Syrian conflict.
Yes, go ahead.
It's about, America, United Nations and the Arab League, they did their thing and went to Libya to do what they had to do to get Gaddafi out. But why can't they do the same thing to get the killer out of Syria?
Thank you, caller.
The Syrian opposition and its umbrella organization, the Syrian National Council, does not want an international military intervention. It hopes that an international military intervention is not necessary. It does need international intervention, again, in the form of monitors on the ground. And again, the hope is that Assad would have some sense in him to leave, which we don't think is going to happen, given his behavior. Another hope is that there would be, at the top in Syria, dissension, folks around him that would simply kick him out. So again, the hope is that there is no need for an international military intervention, that civilians at least are protected for the time being.
Let me ask you, Murhaf, about one of the reasons that people are so worried about what happens in Syria, outside of the bloodshed that's already occurred and the potential that could come, is that the issue of minority rights. And I use the term minority to encompass all. You had certainly a brutal regime in power, but there was under that, you had the sort of a level of protection of certain minorities because of this repressive dominant rule. People worry about what comes next. And is there, the opposition now exists as opposition to Assad as opposed to an affirmation for something. When someone is sitting back and sort of wondering, you know, this is an evil I know, which is perhaps better than one I don't know, what is your response to that?
First, this is a national uprising. It is not an uprising against any particular sector, any particular segment of the population. It is a national uprising against nearly 50 years of authoritarian rule. Second, the Assad regime has and is doing its utmost to turn it into a sectarian strife in order precisely to scare the minorities into thinking that should his regime collapse, that they would be slaughtered or what have you. Of course, this is rubbish. This is Assad's propaganda. The Syrian National Council, again, which is the umbrella organization of the Syrian opposition movement, has declared that it wants a Syria that is based on civil and democratic laws, and to build a civil and democratic state in which all of its citizens are equal before the law, in which the state has an equal distance before all. And in fact, in addition to this, in the 7-man presidential council of the Syrian National Council, the minorities are represented. In the General Secretariat of the Syrian National Council, the minorities are represented, and so is the case in the General Assembly of the Syrian National Council. So again, this is not a sectarian war, and the opposition does not want it to be a sectarian war, and all Syrians are going to be treated equally before the law after the collapse of the Assad regime.
Thank you, Murhaf, for joining us today. I'm afraid we're out of time, but it's nice that you're sounding very hopeful about what's coming, which is a bit different than what we are all hearing.
I am very hopeful because history is on the side of freedom and on the side of people who call for freedom.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
When we come back, a look at what's next for the Occupy movement with Ziad Jilani of thinkprogress.org, and more of your calls. Stay tuned.